Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We're going to get started if everybody can find their seats. Good morning. I want to welcome everybody to From Dream to Reality, Advancing Equity in Homeownership. My name is Brett D'Antonio. I'm the CEO of Habitat for Humanity Seattle-King and Kittitas Counties. Today, we welcome a dynamic group of housing justice advocates to the stage. Dr. Bernice A. King, CEO of the King Center, academic and best-selling author Richard Rothstein, Nicole Bascomb-Green of the Black Home Initiative, and Natasha Reed Rice, Vice President of Housing Opportunities and Mission Engagement for Habitat for Humanity International. Today's program will include keynotes addresses from all three of these dynamic leaders before they sit down for a panel discussion entitled Beloved Community Talks and Courageous Community Conversations. Where do we go from here? The discussion, moderated by Natasha Reed Rice, draws from the title of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s fourth and final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And focuses on the legacy and future of affordable homeownership advocacy. At Habitat for Humanity, our mission is to build strength, stability, and self-reliance through shelter. We honor the work of those who've come before us, and we recognize the work ahead. That's why we'll close today's program by unveiling the name of Habitat for Humanity's largest single-building multifamily project in the country. Situated on Martin Luther King Jr. Way, the project is a testament to Dr. King's vision and the beloved community and will be dedicated to his legacy. At the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, Dr. Bernice A. King continues the work begun by her parents by transforming what was initially a memorial into a living tribute. The King Center is an educational resource, a community hub, and an institution dedicated to turning MLK's message into programming that emboldens the next generation of changemakers. May the King Center's and Dr. Bernice A. King's messages inspire us all to walk out of today's event feeling activated in our own work in fair housing. The work of building affordable homes may sound straightforward, but the impact is vast and multi-generational. Through our work, we create communities that connect individuals and families with positive ripple effects that include improved financial stability, better educational outcomes for children, and renewed hope for the future. Seeking solutions to the housing shortage locally and nationally is not possible without first building a coalition of like-minded organizations, both public, private, and nonprofit, that prioritize building abundant, affordable housing. To that end, thank you to Habitat for Humanity International, the King Center, and the Black Home Initiative for partnering with us not only to make this event possible, but for the work of bringing together futures to our communities possible. Our first speaker I'd like to introduce is Natasha Reed Rice, who serves as Habitat for Humanity International's Vice President of Housing Opportunities and Mission Engagement. She's a member of Habitat's senior leadership team, leading the development and execution of Habitat's global strategy to engage colleagues across its global network to drive mission-driven culture, build bridges, and curate community. Please welcome Natasha Reed Rice. Thank you.
Good morning. It is great to be in Seattle, and I think our team gets all the credit for bringing the sunshine. That's what I heard. That's what I heard. So thank you so much, Brett, for your introduction, but more importantly, for your partnership and the work that we're doing through Habitat for Humanity International. We know that we cannot do without great partners like the Black Homeownership Initiative, our affiliates within the various cities and areas that we serve, but also with all of you all in here today. So we're so glad to be in this space. Last week, Habitat for Humanity International kicked off its 9th annual awareness and fundraising campaign, which we call Home is the Key. The campaign coincides with the National Fair Housing Month and calls attention to the need for affordable housing to help open the door of equitable home ownership across the United States. The U.S. housing crisis, as we know, affects every region in the country. While the challenges are different, The severity of the housing crisis is no less in rural areas than it is in smaller towns and urban areas in places like Seattle-King County. So that's why Home is the Key is such an important campaign. It reminds us that a safe, decent, and affordable home is the key to connection, well-being, stability, wealth building, even going across divides that have so divided our nation in times like these. It reminds us that shelter is not just a privilege, it's a human need. It reminds us that housing shouldn't be a partisan issue. Habitat is working together with local affiliates, including Habitat for Humanity Seattle-King County, corporate partners, community leaders, and volunteers like those of you in this space to develop more inclusive communities and to create areas of opportunities where families can thrive. So we thank Habitat Seattle-King County. We thank each of you for your support and partnership in this campaign of Home is the Key. Now, are you ready to turn dream into reality with us today? Let us hold a few things in mind, and I'm going to begin to introduce our three amazing keynote speakers. We are so excited to have them today. But one I'd like to put forth is a vision of what it looks like to create and how to create a beloved and thriving community. Dr. King said that our goal is to create a beloved community, and this goal will require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our lives. And just to connect it to one other component that I think ties so directly to the work that we are striving to do through housing. He goes on to say, from a sermon that he preached at Riverside Church, A Time to Break Silence, that on the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only the initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. The work that we do is not limited to one house at a time. The work that we do together helps to rebuild that Jericho road, helps to address the systemic inequities, helps to figure out how we connect across difference so that we all can live in a better, beloved, and thriving community. So to continue this conversation, I want to begin by introducing our first keynote speaker. She's one of y'all. She's your homegirl. She is from here. She's, as she was explaining to me this morning, comes from a long line of folks from Seattle in this area. So this is truly her home. Our first keynote speaker is Nicole Bascomb-Green, and she is the owner and designated broker of Bascomb Real Estate Group. With 30 years of experience in both the banking and real estate sectors, Nicole has held various key positions, including leader, banker, underwriter, CRA and CSR officer, and real estate broker. She holds a master's degree in business administration and a bachelor's in marketing, and has used her education and extensive experience to drive efforts aimed at increasing financial education, home ownership, generational health, and wealth. Nicole is also a core leadership team member for the Black Home Initiative, where Habitat Seattle plays an active role. We are so grateful to stay in partnership with you and the Black Home Initiative as we continue to launch our work forward. The BHI Network's shared priority is to create opportunities for 1,500 new low and moderate income Black households to own a home in South Seattle, South King County, and North Pierce County within the next 5 years. That's a true aspirational goal. It's a dream, but we're here today to make it a reality. Please join me in welcoming Nicole Bascomb-Green to the stage.
Good morning, Seattle. It's truly an honor to be here. I want to first give an honor to the head of my life, who is Jesus Christ. Our distinguished guests, thank you for being here in Seattle and taking the trip. And to all of you for joining us today, I really appreciate your time and the opportunity to speak before you. I was humbled to be chosen to sit with these esteemed leaders and discuss the very important topic of homeownership, specifically Black homeownership. We as a nation, and more pointedly, communities under constant threat find ourselves in a very peculiar time. Our organizations are under attack. The very way of life for some of us is under attack. There's chaos in places where we assumed the best and brightest were running our government. Many people are afraid of being attacked, losing their jobs, and the list goes on. But for me, I see this as fertile ground for the work we have begun here in Western Washington with the Black Home Initiative, or BHI. Many of you may see our stickers. You'll see some of us in the room. We're weaving on a daily. This is work that we do every day in community, in network, and it's an honor to be a part of this work. We are here for such a time as this to stand firm in our conviction to support foundational Black Washingtonians, and that's very key. Being a foundational Black Washingtonian, we are a small but mighty community, and it's really important that we focus on the realization of the dream of homeownership for those who have not had the opportunity to do that or have lost that opportunity. And not just for the sake of owning a home, but all the things we know are the benefits of that ownership. This network of private, public, government, for-profit, and nonprofit organizations have come together to change a system that was built to keep us out. We have organizations and individuals from all walks of life leaning into this very specific and important work with a shared priority, a singular goal that can and will have a ripple effect across this state and nation. We know that anything worth having is worth fighting for, and make no mistake, we are in a fight. I grew up just 1.5 miles from here in the heart of the Central District, which was the historic Black community. I watched my community be forcefully displaced with precision by the powers that be, and now the community no longer exists. This is the story of BHI and why we exist. This is also the story of Habitat and its beginning at Koinonia Farms in Americus, Georgia, with Christian principles at its foundation. Acknowledging the racist practices affecting Black people and the systems that were created to block the opportunities for homeownership and collective advancement, and using a communal approach to making that change. Now Habitat has grown into an international brand that has brought all you good folks here today. But the question is, how will Habitat and all the other partners in this work leverage their collective might to change the narrative around access to homeownership? BHI is one of the answers to that question, working within a network to support not just your brand or organization, but elevating the work of partners in the network, sharing best practices and opening doors for organizations that may not have the connectivity your considerable organization may, or the resources. It takes the collective effort of the entire network to reach this goal, and that goes to the heart of this work. This is the ministry aspect of what it is we are doing in this region. In closing, I want to thank Habitat for this opportunity and for being a true network partner. It isn't about one organization, because one organization cannot make a real lasting change. It is about everyone in this network putting the needs of the network over individual needs. Organizations like Africatown Community Land Trust, Bird Bar Place, our Pacific Northwest Habitat affiliates, HomeSite, the Seattle and Tacoma Urban Leagues, Western Washington Realtist, and all of the 120 plus network partners I can't name here today. Holding up other partners instead of your work when that organization is a better fit for the task at hand is part of the work that we do here at BHI. Supporting each other when it may seem counterintuitive to do so, or uncomfortable because we live in a society with a scarcity mindset. But we have a gift and an opportunity to do some history-making work, and I, for one, would all are ready to embrace our part in elevating this work. Joshua 1:9 says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." So with that, I want to read our statement of resolve. When we started to see some changes in our country, and we all know what that is, a lot of folks had to stop and ask the question, specifically those who are doing work in communities that are marginalized, do we still want to be bold? Do we still want to say with the work that we're doing? And BHI said, absolutely. We're going to stay bold and continue to do this work. So I wanted to share with you our statement of resolve as I close. Civic Commons was born out of a clear assessment that inequity in our region was growing, despite our investment that sought to overcome it. That realization was a canary in the coal mine. The tumultuous year of 2020 included the horrendous murder of George Floyd. This sparked a level of awareness for many people, those who live near, never intersected with the harsh realities of the discrimination so many in our nation face. The Black Home Initiative Network emerged early in 2021 to mobilize an entirely new level of engagement by all sectors. Its intention was to strike deep into the heart of entrenched structural and institutional racism, the forces limiting access to intergenerational wealth through homeownership. The stark racial wealth gap, evident in data on homeownership rates and intergenerational wealth, was shocking to many, as was the realization that this is not a thing of the past, but a very real consequence of the lingering discrimination embedded in the systems and practices of today. The conviction that these must be repaired is the basis for BHI's existence. Right now, in the face of deliberate efforts to hold us back by stirring chaos and instilling fear, the BHI network refuses to be dissuaded. As noted by Washington Post opinion columnist Karen Ataya, writing about the new DOJ report on the 1921 Tulsa race massacres, still, we must ask whether defenders of civil rights are acting as boldly as the enemies of progress. We will not succumb to the present-day headwinds. We have been here before, and we will act as boldly as the forces that seek to stop our progress. We will embrace and utilize the commitment of the region we live in. We know that BHI's focus, changing systems that for so long have kept that doors of opportunity closed to foundational Black homebuyers and business owners, has already benefited families, communities in our region. So we will press on, and we will prevail. We are strengthened by knowing that BHI is a movement and we are not alone. As a network of partners, we are bound together not by force or structure, but by our determination to reach a shared destination together. We are like a murmuration of birds, moving independently, yet also in synchrony, responding to the ever-changing winds with the agility of each and the power of all. BHI continues to hear from others who covet what we have and what we are doing here. This signal affirms our work. The canary in daylight sings. So today, we double down on our commitment to our shared goals, and we stand together, resolved to prevail. We shall not be moved. Thank you.
Me wanting to shout amen, stand up, clap hands. Thank you for that, Nicole, because that resolve, that commitment, you're connecting into our founding vision coming out of Koinonia, just is a wonderful way to restate our resolve, because it compels us to do this work, this very hard work in this moment. To further share with us some of the historical framing as well as contemporary challenges in this space, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce a very dear friend of mine, Richard Rothstein. He won't like me reading this part, but I'm going to read it anyway so that you all know a little bit more about him. Richard is a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Many of you know him as the author of The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America, which recovers and retells the story of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas throughout the United States, creating racially homogeneous neighborhoods and patterns that violate the Constitution and require remediation. He's also the co-author of its sequel with his daughter Leah Rothstein, which is now available in a paperback edition, Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law, which describes how we can take active steps in our own communities to redress the segregation whose constitutional origins the color of law described. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Richard Rothstein, and as he comes, I'll share this last story. When I first met Richard, he was giving a speech at a Habitat event, and all of the things that he was sharing in the color of law, I ran to the front before he could finish to make sure I could shake his hand, because one of the things he said at the end is, anyone else interested in starting the new civil rights movement? Come join me. Richard, won't you please come?
Thank you, Natasha. I tried to explain to Natasha that once you retire, you get all kinds of phony titles. And she insists on listing them, but they make no difference. Here I am, an old man, talking to all you youngsters, and I'm glad to have the opportunity. As Natasha mentioned, I wrote a book and published in 2017 called The Color of Law. Before I worked on that, and I've been working on it now, that topic for about 15 years, I knew nothing about housing. I was a journalist, a policy writer in the field of K through 12 education. That's what I knew. That was my specialty. That's what I knew about. And I gradually came to the realization that the reason that African American children, in particular, have achievement at lower levels on average than middle-class white children is not because, as the dominant theory that was advocated by both Democrats and Republicans at the time, it was not because black children had lazy teachers and schools that weren't trying very hard. The reason was that they were attending segregated schools that concentrated children with the most serious social and economic disadvantages into single schools that were overwhelmed by these social and economic problems. How can you get the same achievement from children who, for example, come to school with asthma at higher rates than middle-class white children and are up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day? How can you get the same achievement from children who were more susceptible and exposed to lead poisoning that has a measurable impact on their IQ? How can you get the same kind of achievement from children who come to school with dental cavities that are untreated because they have no primary care and are in pain as a result? All of these things make a tiny difference in achievement. But when you add them all up, they pretty much explain the difference in achievement between black and white children. So I began to think that maybe the biggest problem facing education was segregated schools. It wasn't lazy teachers. It wasn't low expectations. It wasn't they weren't tested enough. It was because the schools were segregated and concentrating children with these problems that were not being addressed in our communities. So I began to look into why schools were segregated, and it took me a while, but I finally realized that schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation is an educational problem, housing segregation. And that's how I began this research. At the time, I, like I think most of you, believed that the reason we had segregated neighborhoods in this country was because of something we call de facto segregation. I'm sure you've all heard that term. The reason of de facto segregation is because, white homeowners and landlords discriminated and wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans. Or maybe it was banks and real estate agents and developers that discriminated, private businesses. Or maybe it was just that people like to live with each other of the same race. That's why we're segregated. All of these bigoted but individual decisions, private decisions, is what created segregation. And I, like many people, thought that, well, if we had this kind of de facto segregation, segregation that happened naturally by accident, there's not much we can do about it. It has to unhappen naturally or by accident. And so I began to do this research, and I found that, in fact, that's an utter myth. We do not have segregation by accident in this society. We do not have segregation by private bigotry in this society. We have segregation because of racially explicit public policies at the federal, state, and local level that were designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area in this country. Of course, there was private bigotry, but private bigotry was required by federal law, by federal government, by state and local governments. And had the federal government and state and local governments followed their constitutional responsibilities, then private bigotry would not have been permitted to flourish. So let me give you one example. I don't have a lot of time this morning, but I'll give you one example of the kind of policy that the federal government followed, and I wrote about in this book. It may be the most powerful policy that created our segregation. In the immediate period after World War II, the federal government, two agencies, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, decided to move all of the white middle class and working class families who were living in urban areas at the time out of those urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs from which African Americans would be prohibited from entering. Now, we were not a suburban country at that time. At the time, we were a manufacturing economy. Factories had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So both the black and white workers in these factories, the employees of the banks and the insurance companies that were servicing this industrial economy, all were living in urban areas, much more desegregated than we know today. I'm not suggesting they were fully integrated, but people were living much closer to each other then than they are today. The federal government began this program of moving the whites out of those areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. The example I used, but they exist here, and I described some in the Seattle area as well, but the example I used in the book was Levittown, east of New York City, something you've probably all heard of. 17,000 homes in one rural area. Levitt, the builder, was a bigot. If he was left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold to African Americans, but he couldn't find a bank that would lend him the money to build this project. No bank would do it. They thought it was a crazy idea. The only way he could get the loans to buy the land and build this development, this is true in Seattle and the suburbs created by Boeing and other major builders here in the mid-20th century in Seattle, as well as around the country. The only way they could get the funds to build these projects was by going to the federal government, requesting a bank guarantee for their loans, and the federal government gave them this bank guarantee on condition that they never sell home to an African American. The federal government even required Levitt and these other builders here and elsewhere, and you know this very well now from your Covenant Homeownership Act research, required them to place a clause in the deed of every home, prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a racially explicit, unconstitutional policy. Now, we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. The Fair Housing Act said, okay, federal government, okay, private builders, you can no longer discriminate, but it did nothing to undo the effects of the discrimination that had happened in the last quarter century. And the effects, as you all know, were enormous, because those homes that were subsidized by the federal government in these all-white suburbs unexpectedly appreciated in value. Nobody expected them to go in value the way they did. The white factory workers and middle-class workers who bought these homes with federal subsidies needed a place to live. We had a housing shortage. That's why they moved to these places. It wasn't because they thought they were going to get rich. The homes at the time sold in today's money for about $100,000 apiece. Today, not in Seattle and not anywhere in the country do they sell for $100,000 apiece. They sell for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, $1 million, $2 million or more, these $100,000 homes. The white families who bought these homes unexpectedly became rich as a result of this appreciation in the value of their homes. They used the wealth that they gained to send their children to college. They used it to take care of temporary emergencies, maybe unemployment or health emergencies. They used it to subsidize their own retirements, and they bequeathed wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit public policy, unconstitutional policy, in blatant violation of both the Fifth and the 14th Amendments to our Constitution, were prohibited from participating in this program that generated this kind of wealth. The result is we have an enormous wealth gap in this country today between blacks and whites. On average, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. You'd think that, well, that's a disparity, but you'd think that at least if the income ratio was 60%, African Americans would have wealth that's about 60% of white wealth. You can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although we have a 60% income gap, African American wealth in this country, on average, household wealth, is about 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity, which continues to control the inequality in housing that we have today, the kinds of things that the Black Home Initiative is trying to overcome, that enormous disparity is the result of unconstitutional federal policy that has never been remedied. Never been remedied. The Fair Housing Act did nothing to remedy the consequences of this unconstitutional behavior. Well, any reasonable interpretation of the Constitution would say that if you have a constitutional violation, you should have a remedy for it. But we have a Supreme Court today, as well as a federal government, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but a Supreme Court today and for the last 50 years that ignores its obvious obligation to remedy the unconstitutionality of our housing segregation. Well, I wrote this book. Some of you may have read it, and most people who read it, many people read it, people who came to talks I gave like this, even some who came up and shook my hand, asked me, well, what can we do about it now? And I thought I was going to get to really retire at that point. But I got asked this question so many times that I felt like I had to answer it. And since, as I said, this was a book of history, and I was an education expert, I knew nothing about housing. I had to recruit somebody to help me co-author a new book that explained what we can do about it now. And it turned out that just by accident, my daughter was a housing consultant in the affordable housing industry. So I begged her for a few years to come work with me. The last thing she ever wanted to do was work with her father. But she finally agreed, and we wrote a sequel book, which is available out there, called Just Action, which I think is a much more important book than The Color of Law, because it tells us what we can do about it. Now, we understood when we wrote this book that there is no national political will, and this was long before the Trump dictatorship. There's no national political will to remedy this at a federal level. But we understood that once you have the segregated patterns that we have today, here and everywhere in the country, it's local policy, local programs that reinforce and maintain it. And so there's an enormous opportunity at the local level to take action that can really change the segregation of this country. I'll give you just one quick example. There are so many that we describe in this book of local programs that require local action, even though they're addressing a problem that was federally created. Now, we have today neighborhoods that are lower income and predominantly black. We have neighborhoods that are higher income and predominantly white because of this federal policy. And we finance our schools and libraries and fire departments with a property tax. Well, African-American homeowners, and there are a considerable number of them, 40% of African-American households own their own homes today, compared to 70% of white households. But African-American homeowners living in predominantly black neighborhoods pay property taxes at a higher rate than white homeowners do, living in predominantly white neighborhoods. They do this for a number of reasons. One is, and I'll just briefly describe it, most, and I'm sure this is true in Seattle and King County, most county assessors, and they do assessments that property taxes are based on, don't do a physical reassessment every year. They don't go around neighborhoods and try to look at a home every year and compare comparables. They reassess every 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And in the intervening time, they adjust the assessments for a common inflation factor. Well, over time, property values in white neighborhoods appreciate in value faster than property values in black neighborhoods do. The result is that black homeowners are paying property taxes at an assessed value that's closer to their market value than white homeowners who are paying property taxes at an assessed value that's farther below their market value. The result is that African Americans are paying higher property taxes, bearing a higher burden of financing schools and libraries and fire departments and all the other things that are paid for by property taxes. This is a purely local problem. The federal government has nothing to do with assessing properties. It's done by local city and county tax assessors. It can be addressed locally, even though the underlying condition that it's causing it was federal. It can only be done if, as Natasha referred to, we have a new civil rights movement that brings together both African Americans and whites in a common enterprise to redress this and many, many other local problems that reinforce and sustain the segregation that was so unconstitutionally created and that we've done nothing about it. Now, as I said, the Supreme Court has banned fixing the unconstitutional policies it itself blessed when they were created. And we now have an administration that is aligned with the Supreme Court and even going a bit further, if you can believe that, than the Supreme Court in banning any efforts to redress segregation. We had a senator, Cory Booker of New Jersey, who recently gave a 25-hour speech saying the only thing we have to do at this point is to cause some good trouble. And that doesn't mean just writing policy papers and talking among ourselves about how terrible things are. It means joining together across racial lines to create a new civil rights movement, local community groups, local neighborhood groups that are going to take action to do this. The best example in this country of a program that is confronting directly the need to redress this segregation is the Covenant Homeownership Act here in the state of Washington. The Covenant Homeownership Act, as you know, is based on research that I became familiar with over 10 years ago, research that documented the extent to which homes in suburbs of Seattle and the rest of the state of Washington had those clauses in their deeds required and frequently by the federal government, blessed by state governments that recorded them in deeds, and every time a state government recorded one of those covenants in a deed that was violating the 14th Amendment, they documented over 80,000 of them so far in the state of Washington, over half of them here in King County. The Covenant Homeownership Act says that anybody, any African American or anybody in particular who was excluded by one of those covenants, it was also Native Americans and Hispanics as well, anybody excluded by those covenants should have a remedy. And the state of Washington, in order to remedy this, placed a transfer tax on any property transaction in the state of $100. It generates about $100 million a year. And so far, under this Covenant Homeownership Act, racially specific grants, down payment assistance grants in confrontation with the aims of the Trump administration and the Supreme Court to say that you have to pretend that race doesn't exist. They have granted down payment assistance of roughly $100,000 to about 350 so far homeowners in the state of Washington, 2/3 of whom are African American. Another large section of the remaining third are Hispanics, in order to address, in a way that the federal government refuses to do and most other local governments refuse to do around the country, the segregation that was unconstitutionally created. The Covenant Homeownership Act is now being amended, hopefully, in your state legislature to increase eligibility from households that have 100% of area median income up to 120%. To me, that's a crucial reform because lower middle class families are as stressed in housing today as are poor families. And restricting this to only lower income families is another form of segregation. And so we need to expand that. It also grants people who've received these down payment grants and have lived in their homes for 5 years the opportunity to have the down payment grants completely forgiven. It's a very important reform. These are two very important reforms. I hope it passes in the state legislature. And I hope that all of you will not only continue to support the Homeownership Act, the Covenant Homeownership Act, but continue to promote it throughout the country as a model for what we need to do in order to confront the continued unconstitutional and unlawful behavior of the federal government in refusing to redress the segregation that our government on our behalf created. So thank you very much.
That was awesome. Thank you. So now you all can join me in the chorus that tells him he can't retire. I mean, the knowledge, the history, the presentation of that history, it compels us differently when we're armed with understanding how and why we are actually where we are today. So thank you so much, Richard. And I'm very anxious to get to our panel. I'm even more anxious to introduce our next speaker. It's my great honor to introduce Dr. Bernice A. King, the CEO of the King Center. Dr. King is not only the youngest daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, but also a tireless advocate for justice, equality, and peace, continuing the mission of her parents. I often say she carries a heavy mantle, and I'm grateful to join in some of the efforts with her. The King Center, founded by her mother in 1968, serves as the official organization dedicated to preserving the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and advancing his philosophy of nonviolence. Dr. King has worked to ensure that her father's vision of the beloved community where love and justice triumph over hate and division remains at the forefront of the work being done today. The King Center plays a pivotal role in educating individuals and organizations on Nonviolence 365, which is a comprehensive, proactive program for creating a more just and peaceful society. Under Dr. Bernice King's leadership, the King Center has grown into a beacon for social change, offering training, resources, and leadership development to empower communities to carry forward the fight for civil rights and social justice. In addition to her leadership at the King Center, Dr. King is deeply committed to building bridges and cultivating dialogue on pressing issues such as racial and economic justice, equality, and human rights. Her work continues to inspire countless individuals and organizations to pursue justice through nonviolent action and to work toward healing in our communities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bernice A. King.
So good morning. I told Natasha earlier, you took me out of my comfort zone. And then she placed me behind two experts in the housing arena. So I hope you can bear with me this morning. I'm glad to be here to participate in this momentous occasion, which includes the naming of a single-family, multifamily home development in the only county named for my father. I want to thank Habitat for Humanity, especially my friend and colleague, Reverend Attorney Natasha Reed Rice, for inviting me. It is an honor to stand before you as we reflect on the ongoing fight for housing justice. A fight, of course, that my father, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was deeply committed to, one that is inseparable from the larger struggle for civil rights, human dignity, and economic justice. We're gathered here today to honor the legacy of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, just one day before the anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, a landmark law that was passed in honor of my father 7 days after he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. It was a direct response to the moral urgency of his work of championing the cause of fair and equitable housing for all Americans. While many remember his pivotal roles in advancing civil rights and economic justice, my father understood that civil rights were not just about the right to vote, the right to sit at a lunch counter, or the right to ride at the front of the bus. It is crucial to recognize that his profound commitment to ensuring that every individual, regardless of race or socioeconomic status, has access to safe and affordable housing. He often spoke about the interconnectedness of economic justice and civil rights. He understood that without access to fair housing, the broader goals of equality and opportunity would remain elusive. He once remarked, "The nation has been a false witness to freedom, giving the Negro, at that time, a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds." This metaphor poignantly captures the systemic economic disenfranchisement that Black Americans have faced, a reality that is perpetuated by ongoing housing discrimination. In 1966, my father stood before a crowd at Chicago's Soldier Field and declared, "We are tired of living in rat-infested slums. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all of God's children." His words underscored the urgent need to address the deplorable housing conditions that many Black families endured, a reality that was both a symptom and a perpetuator of systemic racial inequality. That same year, he and the SCLC helped launch the Chicago Freedom Movement, a courageous and bold campaign to end economic oppression in the North. My father and his team faced hostility. Bricks were thrown at him, angry crowds gathered, but he knew that housing was one of the great battlegrounds for justice. He knew that without housing stability, families could not build wealth, children could not access quality education, and communities could not thrive. To call national attention to the issue, he moved our family, my mother, me, and my siblings, into a rundown apartment in Lawndale, a neglected Black neighborhood in Chicago. There we witnessed firsthand the stark contrast between poverty and the vast wealth surrounded it. He later described what he saw and described it in vivid detail. He said, "The slum of Lawndale was truly an island of poverty in the midst of an ocean of plenty. From this vantage point, you saw only hundreds of children playing in the streets. You saw the light of intelligence glowing in their beautiful dark eyes. Then you realized their overwhelming joy because someone had simply stopped to say hello." As a child, I heard my father and others talking about marching as a part of the Chicago movement. At the age of 3, I was eager to be a part of that movement. I kept asking Daddy and Mommy, "When are we going to march?" Seeing my excitement, my parents caved in and agreed to let me take part. I was so thrilled to join the march that would lead Soldiers Field and end at the doors of City Hall, where my father would tact their housing and economic demands. But I fell asleep on the shoulders of someone along the way and missed most of the march. But I'm sure subconsciously that moment stays with me, not just as a personal memory, but as a symbol of how deeply my family has been woven into the fight of justice and equity, especially in the area of housing. When the Fair Housing Act was signed into law, April 11th, 1968, it was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era. You heard Richard talk about how that went. One in which Black families and other marginalized communities could access the American dream of home ownership without fear of discrimination. But the truth is, while the law changed, things really stayed the same. Practices such as redlining, discriminatory lending, predatory mortgages, reduced appraisals, exclusionary zoning have continued to keep Black families locked out of home ownership. In 1968, the home ownership rate was 41%. Today, it remains below 45%, lower than it was when my father was fighting this fight. Meanwhile, white home ownership rates have continued to rise. Black and brown families are still more likely to be denied mortgages, pay higher interest rates, and be displaced by gentrification, even in cities like where we live, that once was a majority black city. That should shake us and move us to action. My father warned us about this. He said the problem of housing discrimination is not a Negro or black person's problem. It's an American problem. And America must confront it. Thank you for writing the sequel, Richard. Nearly 60 years later, the barriers we face remain deeply entrenched. One of the clearest reflections of this is the homeownership gap. Approximately 74% of white Americans own homes, compared to just 45% of black Americans. This disparity is one of the primary drivers of the racial wealth gap, because home ownership is the foundation of generational wealth in America. This gap is not just about property, it's about power, opportunity, and dignity. If these economic disparities and patterns persist, according to the data, the median wealth of black Americans is projected to fall to 0 by 2058. Today, instead of strengthening the Fair Housing Act, recent actions by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, pose significant risks to the foundational principles of the Fair Housing Act, undermining its very purpose. One such action is the elimination of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. HUD Secretary Scott Turner announced recently the rescission of this rule, arguing that it imposed undue burdens on local communities and property owners. However, this decision effectively removes critical oversight mechanisms designed to ensure that federal funds are used proactively to address racial segregation and housing disparities. And it not only undermines the enforcement of fair housing laws, but as critics have rightly pointed out, it also signals a retreat from the federal government's commitment to actively addressing segregation and discrimination in housing and dismantling systemic housing discrimination. I'm going to say this again for sales purposes as well. Get the book. Thank you, Richard, once again. Cuts to HUD's budget and enforcement capabilities has been significant. Programs that provide rental assistance, fair housing enforcement, and housing vouchers are facing severe reductions. Organizations that provide legal aid to families facing eviction and discrimination are closing their doors due to funding cuts. Targeting of black and brown communities through lending discrimination and gentrification continues unabated. Predatory lending continues to strip wealth from black families. Rising home prices and policies that favor developers over residents are displacing long-standing black and brown communities. The implications of these actions are profound. Housing discrimination remains a pervasive issue in our society, with black and brown communities continuing to face significant barriers. Studies have shown that these communities are more likely to be denied mortgages, charge higher interest rates, and steered toward less desirable neighborhoods. Such discriminatory practices not only hinder economic mobility, but also perpetuate cycles of poverty and segregation. These policy shifts are not occurring in a vacuum, as we know. They're not just numbers on a budget sheet. They have real devastating consequences for families trying to survive, for communities trying to thrive, and for a nation that claims to stand for justice and seeking to be an economic force in the world. They're part of a broader pattern of reducing federal support for fair housing initiatives. As we reflect on these challenges, it's imperative that we recognize the urgency of our collective action. The Fair Housing Act was not merely a legislative achievement, it was a moral commitment to uphold the dignity and rights of every individual. To allow its provisions to be weakened is to betray the commitment and the sacrifices made to realize it. My father often reminded us, justice too long delayed is justice denied. And the reality is justice has been delayed for too many black and brown families when it comes to home ownership, generational wealth, and housing stability. It is our moral obligation to continue this work because the dream of fair and equitable housing is still just that, a dream. Therefore, we must advocate for the reinstatement and strengthening of policies like the HFHI rule that hold local jurisdictions accountable for promoting inclusive and equitable housing practices. We must demand that HUD and other federal agencies, in spite of these times, prioritize funding and support for fair housing enforcement, ensuring that organizations on the front lines have the resources they need to combat discrimination effectively. But we can go around the system. My father warned, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual doom. These words resonate today as we witness the reallocation of resources away from critical social programs, including those aimed at ensuring fair housing. The divestment from such programs not only undermines the principles of justice and equality, but also erodes the moral foundation of our society and makes us vulnerable on the world stage. In the final analysis, we must address the broader systemic issues that contribute to housing disparities. This includes tackling economic inequalities, reforming lending practices, and investing in communities that historically have been marginalized. It requires a holistic approach that recognizes the multifaceted nature of housing discrimination and seeks to dismantle the structures that sustain it, which includes the mindset that especially devalues Black, brown, and indigenous lives. My parents' vision of the beloved community was not a utopian dream. It was a roadmap for justice. In the beloved community, every person has a fair and equitable opportunity to thrive, no matter their race, income, or background. But we cannot build the beloved community if families are still being pushed out of their neighborhoods due to rising rents and gentrification. Lenders continue to deny Black and brown families equal access to mortgages. Housing remains a barrier to wealth building rather than the foundation for opportunity. Housing, though, is not just about shelter. It's about stability. It's about dignity. It's about a foundation for opportunity. And until we ensure that all families, Black, brown, indigenous, working class, even immigrant families, have access to stable housing, we have not fulfilled my father's dream. As has been noted, my father's, I won't call it his final book because there was one published after he was assassinated, but it was a book published in 1967. Where do we go from here, Chaos of Community? He made it clear that we had a choice. Do we continue to allow systemic injustices to drive us further into chaos, economic and racial division? Or do we come together, builders, policymakers, activists, faith leaders, and everyday people, to dismantle housing discrimination once and for all? Today, that choice is still before us, to work together to build a more just and equitable community, for as he said, we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or together we will be forced to perish as fools. So where do we go from here? We must demand policy changes, hold elected officials accountable, enforce fair housing laws with real consequences, invest in affordable housing at the federal and state levels. We must commit to community-led solutions, as was already talked about, support organizations creating pathways to homeownership, develop local housing initiatives that we spoke about that prioritize longtime residents over outside developers, partner with faith communities and grassroots movements working to protect vulnerable families. We must recognize that housing justice is racial justice. The fight for fair housing is inseparable from the fight for racial and economic equity. We must challenge the systems that continue to exclude and exploit Black and brown communities. My father often said, and we've heard it a lot, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But let me be clear, the arc will not bend on its own. It bends when we pull it, when we push against injustice, when we refuse to stand still while inequity persists. Each of us in this room does have a role to play. Whether you're a policymaker, an activist, a builder, a lender, or a concerned citizen, there's something you can do to advance equity in housing. In closing, let us remember that the fight for fair housing is not just about bricks and mortar. It's about justice. It's about dignity and the fundamental human right to a safe and secure home. As my father envisioned it, it is about building the beloved community, a society rooted in compassion, equity, and mutual respect. The beloved community is within our reach, but only if we build it together. Let us honor my father's legacy by recommitting ourselves to this cause, by standing in solidarity with those who continue to face discrimination, and by working tirelessly to ensure that the doors of opportunity are open to all. Let us honor the legacy of the civil rights movement, not just with words, but with action, not just with remembrance, but with transformation, not just with reflection, but yes, with a new movement toward justice. Let us move forward boldly, courageously, and relentlessly together toward equity, toward opportunity, and toward the beloved community, the creation of the beloved community, where injustice of housing discrimination ceases and love for the dignity of all humanity prevails. Thank you, and God bless you.
Awesome. Right here. Wonderful. Can you pass me water? You want your water bottle? Well, that was wonderful. Are y'all ready now to dive a little deeper? And I was anxious to get to this moment because I have some questions, but I know that some of you may have questions. So if you can go ahead and get those together. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion here, and then following the discussion, we'll open the floor for some of your questions and do our best to answer or to at least entertain and engage with, because we may not have every answer to every question. And I think it's because this topic of housing and how we solve for it, as you all have heard from our amazing speakers this morning, it's very layered. And it can sometimes be complex and yet can also be simple. So let's dig in a little bit more. This portion of our panel discussion is a joint effort between the Beloved Community Talks offered by the King Center and Courageous Community Conversations offered by Habitat through our national programming. And we want to explore, where do we go from here? How do we build community together? How do we take the great understanding of the history of housing in this country in Seattle and really begin to tackle it in today's context and today's reality? So to do that, I'm very excited to have the three of you with us today. Dr. King, I want to pick up where you left off. So your father's vision of the beloved community was deeply tied to economic justice and fair housing. In your speech just now, you emphasize that housing is not just about shelter, but it's also about dignity. It's about the building of generational wealth. So from your perspective, what do you think some of the most urgent steps are that we should take today to move closer to that vision and to that dream?
Well, wow. For me, the first part of what you quoted earlier is about the qualitative difference in our souls. You know, when we have all these different conversations about the problems in our society and fixing them, correcting them, I think a lot of it starts with each and every one of us, the mindset that we have. And I think we have to begin to challenge our thinking about how we see each other as a humanity. Do we see each other as interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent? If we see each other that way, then we'll be much more thoughtful about the decisions that we make concerning everything, and especially economics. We will end up operating from a love-centered way. And so for me, I think that's the most fundamental place to start, because it seems like we keep cycling through problems. We keep cycling through issues. And although there's this great work happening over and over and over again in so many different places, I stand back all the time asking, why haven't we gotten out of the cycle? And it's because we do so much external work and we forsake the internal work. You know, my dad said we live in two realms, the external and the internal. And what has happened is we have cultivated a lot of the external, but we've neglected the internal work that's needed. And so we've got to begin to challenge and develop and help to cultivate the right mindsets to correct a lot of this. When, you know, my father talked about justice, love, justice, and power. He talked about power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. And so we haven't gotten to that place of justice yet because we're not yet love-centered enough to do the work that he was talking about, which is how do we correct all of this history? We keep passing laws on top of laws, but how much of it is love-centered enough and thoughtful enough to say how do we correct these past laws that cause terrible consequences that continue to be perpetuated in the present and perhaps into the future if we don't step back and do that qualitative work.
Right, right. It's your father's theory of interrelatedness says you can't become all that you ought to be until I am all that I ought to be. And I can't become all that I ought to be until you are all that you ought to be.
Exactly.
And so rather than seeing people as other, right, we begin to really see each other as each other.
As each other.
There's no us, them. That's very powerful. Richard, in The Color of Law, you detail how government policies deliberately segregated and divided this country. So now as we reflect on the 57th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, what do you believe are the biggest policy failures that continue to perpetuate housing inequity today?
Well, Natasha, I'm going to answer that a little bit differently. I'm going to talk about what are our failures.
Okay.
Because we know what the policy failures are. They're well known. What's missing is for all of us to engage in our local communities to do something about it. I'm not talking about writing policy papers. I'm not talking about advocating what public officials should do. I'm saying that unless we begin to get active in the way that 60 years ago people were active, unless we begin to get active in our own communities, and I want to emphasize in biracial groups, because we can't do it, whites or blacks, alone.
That's right.
We need the political power that can only come from a biracial movement. Unless we do that, we're going to continue to advocate policies that have no chance of being enacted because there's no political support for them. Cut me off if you want to stop me, because I can talk forever about this.
So I'm not going to stop you, but I am going to prompt you with this one because I think it's so key. And you and I have had this conversation that when we're looking at the affordable housing crisis right now, many people will cite the economic factors. They'll cite the labor costs. They'll cite, which are all valid reasons. They'll cite policy. But we're also seeing a lot of documentation now of the impact of NIMBYism, the not in my backyard, right? Which gets to this qualitative conversation that Dr. King is talking about, and to this notion of working together, right? And NIMBYism, when we look at how it plays out, it does feed into policy. It feeds into land use regulations. It feeds into exclusionary zoning policies. How do we begin to go after that aspect of the community building, which is what I think Just Action answers, but I'd love to hear.
Well, I can give you a couple of examples. After Just Action was published, my daughter and I began writing occasional articles about people who've actually done something about it. There was a suburb of San Francisco a number of years ago, not too many years ago, 5 years ago or 6, Menlo Park, a very, very rich, affluent suburb. There were a few African-American and Hispanic families there. They began to have a reading group that studied The Color of Law at the time. It was long before Just Action was published. And then, educating themselves about that, all of a sudden, in Menlo Park, an issue arose. Like many suburbs today, which are more and more affluent because of the exclusionary zoning rules that you talked about, families were getting smaller. Schools were being closed because the child population was declining. So the school district had a lot of empty property that it was no longer using. The school district couldn't keep teachers and staff because the community was so expensive that people who worked in the schools couldn't afford to live anywhere near there. And Silicon Valley, like at times during the day here in Seattle, the freeways were a parking lot, and so they couldn't get to work. So the school district decided it would build affordable housing on this empty land, and it required a zoning change to do so. Well, they got the zoning change provisionally, and a group of what you called NIMBYs, not in my backyard, decided to get it reversed. And so they put an initiative on the ballot, not only prohibiting the school district from building housing that teachers and staff could afford, but requiring a public referendum for any future change in zoning law anywhere in the community. Well, this reading group, they called themselves Menlo Together, decided they were going to fight this initiative, even though they thought they had no chance of doing it. It was an affluent white community filled with NIMBYs. The thing was on the ballot, but they decided they were going to do it anyway. They started knocking on doors. I don't know how many of you have engaged in knocking on doors, talking to people about these problems and trying to persuade them to join with you in fixing them. Well, they knocked on doors. They expected nobody to receive them with a friendly reception, and they wound up defeating the initiative. And it was only because they got off their duffs and decided to do something in their own communities to fix it, and the school district is now proceeding to build this housing. It may not only be occupied by teachers and staff, but that people of a much lower income than the affluent families that presently live in that community have. So that's one example. I'll give you one other, or two others maybe.
Give me one other.
Just one other? All right, one other. We write in Just Action about Winston-Salem, North Carolina. In Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a number of years ago, there were 6 Presbyterian churches, 3 on the white side of town, 3 on the black side of the town. They had very little to do with each other. This was back in the 1990s. You may recall that Rodney King was beaten by police officers in Los Angeles, and it caused a lot of disruption and protests and riots even in protests of the police officers beating him. And the Presbyterian ministers didn't understand why this was happening. So one of them took the initiative of inviting the other Presbyterian ministers to lunch, biracial lunch of 6 Presbyterian, not all of them came, but 6 Presbyterian
Sounds like a
ministers.
setup for a good joke.
Huh? What?
Sounds like a setup for a good joke.
Well, I'm not allowed to tell jokes, you know
No.
that. I wish I could. And they formed something called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue, which was a group of 40 people, had to be 20 white and 20 black. If anybody left the group, they had to be replaced by somebody of the same race to maintain its biracial character. And the group spent a couple of years studying these issues, eventually got together and created some reforms in Winston-Salem. It was long before they were thinking about housing reforms. They got a curriculum that taught more about racial justice adopted in the school. They got a police review board established. But it wouldn't have happened if these 2 groups of churches got together. So that's an example.
Thank you. That's awesome. And it ties very nicely into one of the initiatives here, the Covenant Homeownership Act, not just an initiative, but a policy that BHI was instrumental in leading.
Absolutely.
So Nicole, tell us some more about the work to even get the Covenant Homeownership Act passed and the why.
So the Covenant Homeownership Act is a phenomenal act that shows the real work of the network. How BHI came together collectively, different organizations, different people, biracial, to ensure that we here in Washington were really speaking to those covenants and the racist practices that kept me and my family in the Central District. You know, we were there because of redlining. I didn't know that growing up. I was a child, all my friends and family, and everyone lived within blocks of us. But as I become older, I realized the policies around that. So the Covenant Homeownership Act was something that, so we in the BHI network, we have several different work groups. And so the policy work group was one that was really pushing that. So many of us, including myself, went to Olympia and testified about how these racial covenants affected us, affected our families, affected our community. And so we were able to pass that law, first time in the legislature. We got it through in 2023. And that was the collective work of BHI, talking about these networks in Just Action that I read and I really loved, and it reminded me of the work we're doing here. It's real. It's palpable, it makes real change, and we here in little Seattle and Washington in the corner of the country are doing some powerful things around homeownership and around housing and changing the systems, not just building new houses or changing policy, but it's a systemic change around providing inventory and affecting lending and policy and pricing. It is a full spectrum of what this work looks like. And so BHI, and there's many folks in this room are part of that work, made that change where Covenant Homeownership Act is now. I've had clients who've been able to buy homes that had the CHA not existed would not be homeowners today. And so that is the powerful work of doing things collaboratively in network and supporting each other in a biracial way, because everyone's at the table with BHI, but we're saying the work that we're doing, which I think is critical. We are supporting foundational Black Washingtonians, period. And what we do know is when a rising tide raises all boats. When you support the least of these, everyone will benefit.
That's right.
So if we fix it for the Black community here in Washington, across the country, everyone will benefit. And the work that your father did in civil rights shows that. Civil Rights Act supported women, immigrants. Everyone benefited from the Civil Rights Act, where the Black folks were in the streets, in the community with partners to change things. So we have a blueprint. It works. We just have to continue to push forward with it.
And it very much aligns with the work that Habitat Seattle-King County has been involved in, and Habitat nationally through our Advancing Black Homeownership work is really focusing in on that curb cut, right? How we get that curb cut in place, it does begin to benefit, as you said, and to rise, the rising tide raises all boats. You touched on this a little bit. We are in a moment in this, and I'm coming to you, Dr. King. And she's like, why are you coming to me with this question? But I think what you're hearing, this is why this is considered a courageous community conversation. This is why this is considered how we have conversations like this to build beloved community, is we have to talk about things that people are very uncomfortable talking about. And if we do not talk about those things, we can't come to solutions that actually solve the problem. So even in sometimes hearing the history that we heard Richard lay out so poignantly, people get uncomfortable hearing that, and so they try to stop our children from learning that history. The purpose of that history is not for folks to feel shamed or guilty, but to understand how we craft solutions to move forward. I often say we've all been given this bag of goods in this country. It's almost like the worst items in your pantry. We just inherited the worst items in our pantry sometimes, and we have to figure out how to make the recipe. How do we, in this moment where many of these conversations about equity, about race, about gender are being tamped down, how do we build a beloved community in this context?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. And I know part of it, and I think your conversation about the mindset, the soul set is so key, but also you're doing some very tangible work.
I think I want to say something. I used to want to, I better not say what I was going to do with it, but I have a saying, don't blame me, I was just born, but let's get together and fix it. That's what you just said. And that's everyone, right? That's the way we're supposed to take this history and not take it as shaming any particular community, because as you said, we've all inherited these issues. We all have to have a vested interest in correcting that, back to that same word, what has happened to us as a nation. We have to have ownership in the problem. When you don't have ownership in the problem, you're not going to participate in the solution.
That's right.
And so the question is, how do we get people to see that this is an American problem? This is not a Black problem, a brown problem, indigenous, or whatever, a poor people's problem, as people would say. This is all of our problem. Back to what you said about my father, what affects one directly affects all indirectly. You know, he wrote a lot in Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos of Community, which I think applies today. And it's interesting, you know, as I refer to him over and over again, I realize that what he gave to us was so poignant and so powerful and yet prophetic that we need to go back, revisit, and grab hold to and move things forward. So he talked a lot about coalition building, organizing across those multiracial lines to look at those things that impact us collectively as community. Because we know if we don't address certain things, other outcomes can happen and can spread to other communities. We can't gate ourselves from all of these problems. You can move as far away. I tell people, when I go around the world, I see us's everywhere. So you can move as far away as you want, but we're gonna find you. Might be a sprinkling of us, but we're gonna be there, which just shows, you know, the interconnectedness and the interrelatedness.
Yeah.
So I think we have to, you know, we're almost beating a dead horse. They've given the evidence of the power of collective work. The issue is, how do people stop trying to reinvent a wheel? What you're doing here, what you all did worked. How do we get that across the nation?
Right. How do we scale it?
Yes, how do we scale that across the nation? Everybody wants to be a hero. I did it, we started it. How come we didn't do it? You know, during the pandemic, I was frustrated because I was like, the number one problem that affected all of us had to do with technology. At that point, we all had to rely on technology, to, whether it was our mobile phones that we already had. Nobody knew about Zoom. I mean, Zoom just took off. And yet we had these digital divides. Why didn't we figure out in that 2-year time period how to solve that problem across the board? Because we don't think about collectivism. We're so individualistically focused in our different organizations, in our corporate lives, in our faith communities, that it's critical that we recognize that the way forward is going to be through that coalition. I believe that's part of what's happening right now in our nation. I believe, because I think of things from a spiritual perspective.
Right.
I believe the allowance of the current leadership was to awaken us and to align us as a humanity. We never would see people connecting the way they're connecting, like they're connecting today, if this would not have happened. I'm not, you know, condoning it, but I'm just saying that it's the Nehemiah effect. You know, in Nehemiah, they were seeking to build the walls, and then, you know, Sanballat, all of them trying to destroy, distract, you know, get them off course. And Nehemiah had to bring the people together. And I always say this verse because I think it resonates, especially now, when he says to the whole assembly, he said, you see, the work is extensive. Anybody agree with that?
Yeah.
And we are widely separated on the wall. Would anybody agree with that? He said, but when you hear the sound of the trumpet, take off E.T. Y'all missed that.
I caught that.
When you hear the sound of the trump, rally together.
Yes.
Rally together. Why is that? Because there's a power in unity, but there's a divine intervention that happens in unity that people always miss. They always miss that. And I'm going to bring this up and I'm done, because it may not directly be about housing, but it's about how we're going to get the work related to housing justice done.
Right.
When Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams
So this
ran
is Georgia.
in Georgia.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, everybody thought the Lieutenant Governor, Casey Cagle, was going to be the Republican nominee.
Yes.
You remember that? Okay. He didn't get it. The next day after he lost, there was a rally with all of the Republican leaders. And I was watching the news, and I called this young lady here, Delise Drain, and I said, oh my God, Kemp's gonna win. Why did I say that? Because the Holy Spirit revealed to me that unity works whether it's for good or not.
Yes, amen.
Period. And so they came together in a way that I had never seen in my life. It was unbelievable. Usually when somebody defeats someone, they don't readily come back and stand with them within a 24-hour time period. But all of the leaders came together. Now, everybody can say cheating, cheating, and cheating. That's our natural belief and could have happened. But there's a God of the universe that allows certain things too. And so there's certain things, messages being sent to us now, and we need to tune in and align. And what you're hearing here today, because I know this is not just about us in the audience, it's about those that are listening too. What you're hearing today is divine information. It's divine intervention. What's happening here in Seattle is very powerful for the rest of the nation. What Richard has written in Color of Law, and now with the, what is it called? Just Action. Just Action. Very critical writings. If we're going to write the course of justice in America, you need to take hold of this information, read these materials, and get busy. Because to me, if I had to pick one area that we should focus on, it's housing, because it affects everything else in this nation.
Absolutely. Thank you. Awesome. And so one of the loudest calls I hear in what you're sharing is this is our moment of opportunity.
It is.
I think a lot of folks who are in this work are feeling some defeated, but what if we looked at it with the lens of opportunity? And I think about that opportunity to build community like we've never built community before.
That's right.
And the building of community defies any of the division that attempts to take it over, right? And I think about, Richard, and maybe this is an opportunity, this is your opportunity to share that other story from Just Action that you were going to share before. Because one of the things that you've talked about in your writings is that the segregated housing patterns didn't only affect education, right? The segregated housing patterns didn't only lead to divisions in the wealth gap, didn't only lead to divisions even in the income gaps, but it also has led to, in some ways, it's the first algorithm. You know, we talk about social media is a very big culprit in this divided nation that we have. Actually, segregated housing patterns is the first algorithm that's led to some of this civic divide, because now you're not having interracial interactions in the grocery store.
That's right.
Not in your PTA meetings. You don't have what I call unintentional run-ins with people who look different than you in the libraries or whatever other communal public spaces. We don't have them in the churches for the most part, because Sunday is still one of the most segregated days in the country, right? So Richard, talk, if you could, share a little bit about, maybe it's something from Just Action or your own other writings on this, like that civic divide. That's one of the other remnants of this federally and state mandated segregated housing system.
Well, yeah, it's troubling. It's very troubling to me that it's so difficult to create these kinds of biracial groups today, more difficult than ever was before, because we are more segregated today than we ever have been before. And as you say, people don't have the opportunity to meet people like themselves of other races. I think you're probably referring to a story I tell in Just Action, my daughter and I tell in Just Action, about a photographer in Chicago.
Yes.
An artist, a photographer in Chicago. Her name is Tanika Johnson. She was an artist. She wasn't a housing advocate. She wasn't a social justice organizer. But she had been bused to a school. She's an African-American living on the south side of Chicago. She had been bused to a school in the north side during the busing period. And she realized that these neighborhoods that she was being bused through, going to school on the north side, were all white, and the neighborhoods that she came from on the south side were all black. It's obvious to me as a writer, but she had seen it for the first time. So when she became an artist as an adult, she went into a neighborhood on the north side, a neighborhood on the south side, and started photographing homes, and then called comparable homes of African Americans and whites, very different kinds of neighborhoods, very different home values, but comparable homes, She knocked on their doors and said, "Do you want to meet your map twin?" And a number of people said yes. So she started to create these meetings, and as a photographer and videographer, she videotaped the meetings of people that agreed to be introduced to somebody they'd never met before, but their map twin on the other side of the city. And these relationships became permanent. Now, she was not an organizer. She didn't take these relationships to try to create activist groups, but they just indicate the kind of thing that can be done. Here's something else that's very simple as a way to start. You know, if it may seem daunting to you to create a biracial group for now, but there's something that every individual here can do. In Just Action, we talk about how, and you referred to this, Bernice, the Fair Housing Act has not been enforced. It only addresses ongoing discrimination, but it doesn't even get enforced in that respect. There was a newspaper on Long Island, New York, called Newsday, that did a study of real estate practices in Long Island. They sent black and white pretend home buyers to the same real estate agents. They wore buttonhole cameras to record their interactions with these real estate agents. They were given identical resumes, same educational background, same family structure, same incomes. They were, the newspaper even bought identical handbags for the women testers when they went to these real estate agencies. And what they found, and this is all online, you can go to Long Island, to Newsday, that's the name of the magazine, the newspaper, and see these videos online. What they found was that in 50% of the cases in New York City, outside of New York City, Long Island, 50% of the cases, African Americans who went to a real estate agent experienced discrimination. In 50% of the cases. They were either shown homes in different neighborhoods or told about homes in different neighborhoods. They had neighborhoods described to them differently than the white testers, or you would like to live in this place, where the white testers were told, oh, you wouldn't want to live there. That kind of thing. Every one of these was a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Every one of these real estate agents who was filmed and doing this kind of thing should have had their licenses lifted by the state licensing agency. The fact that they weren't is a 14th Amendment violation. Well, if this was going on in 50% of the cases in Long Island, you bet it's going on in Seattle and everywhere else in the country. Now, enforcement of the Fair Housing Act is up to us. There are fair housing centers in every community in this country that conduct this kind of paired testing. And you can volunteer to be a tester, not only for home purchases, but there's equal testing being done with landlords. The fair housing centers are underfunded. They're short of volunteers. Every one of us can participate in this kind of activity to help to enforce the Fair Housing Act. And the Trump administration has said it's no longer going to enforce the Fair Housing Act. So that means that if we uncover this kind of discrimination, it's got to be lawsuits filed by the victims themselves. The Justice Department won't do it anymore. That also requires funding and volunteers. Now, this can be done not only in Seattle, but I guess this is going to be shown around the country. Any community has a fair housing center that's short of funds and short of volunteers to do this kind of enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. And that's a place to start. You'll get to know the testers of an opposite race when you have meetings to report your findings.
That's a great example. This is right up your alley, Nicole, as a broker, as well as on the leadership team of BHI. What are some of the barriers you see here locally in Seattle? And then if you could share some of the strategies that you all are using to meet those barriers.
Well, you know, this network work is phenomenal work, but it's hard. Yeah. It has its challenges internally, right? And so we're fairly new still doing this work, 3 years-ish in. And so we have our own challenges internally around what that looks like. Part of that is we have a price issue. The neighborhood I grew up in, the median house price is $1.2 million right now. That's for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath bungalow, 700-ish square foot. And that's any of these blocks over here. You're looking for a house from here to, let's say, 1,000 feet from here. That's the minimum price point.
And this was historically an African-American
Historically,
community.
A black community. And my whole family lived here. And the problem with that is then you get pushed out. When I bought my first house at 24, I couldn't live around my family because I couldn't afford to buy here. So I had to go to the suburbs. And so what we found, that displacement is moving forward south, moving into different locales in South King County. That's where most of us live. Now most of the black community, when I grew up, was here in the Central District. Now 80% of us are in South King County, around 5 or 6 different cities. And so the challenge is trying to get folks from a real estate broker perspective who have the income to qualify, or not even that, it's the assets, because most black folks are income rich but asset poor to that racial wealth gap. We have good jobs here. Seattle has one of the closest gaps from a black-white income perspective, but we still don't have the assets, the wealth, the ability to put 10% down on a $1.2 million home. That's $120,000 cash, right? That opportunity is not available. And so we don't have the ability to support purchasing back in Seattle, even with CHA. The trailer bill you're talking about that we are actually working on, I was just in Olympia Tuesday working on that trailer bill. Increasing that AMI is going to be so critically important because no one at 100% can live in the Central District. But when we get to 120% AMI, 140% AMI, then we're starting to provide opportunity for homeownership to those who truly can buy, who can afford that house, but just don't have the assets to get into that house. So as a broker, in our network, that's what a big part of the problem is also lending, right? Getting approved. Financial institutions have historically been discriminating with either high pricing or full-out denials. Fallout rates we see are astronomical. Here in the area in King County, we had 600 people fall out of the system last year around homeownership.
Wow.
If we can just get half those people to homeownership, we'll get to our goal of 1,500 in no time. But there's so many different systems that are affecting the ability to reach homeownership and then be able to stay in that home.
Right.
So that's why from BHI, and what we want this to be is an archetype for how we move this across the country, because this is a systemic work. We are attacking this on all fronts. I have people in this space who are developers, who are building the properties. We have policymakers who are writing the policies. We have those of us on the ground actually practicing, talking with folks, buying and selling the homes. We have, companies, lenders. I was a lender working on products to help change this narrative. So part of that is understanding that this is a large, complex issue, but it requires a lot of people at the table to attack where they know. I stay in my lane. I know nothing about development. So when people call me and want to talk about BHI and development, I'm not your girl. Let's talk to, Dominic Remy, who's on my core team, who is a builder. Or we're talking about policy, Patience Malaba, who's right here, who runs our policy with the Housing Development Consortium of Seattle-King County. We have some powerful people who are part of this work. And so being able to lean in where you have your specificity with Habitat building product. Habitat products are part of our pipeline. We have a pipeline list in BHI of all the properties that are coming online to support the work that we're doing. So it's an interactive work that requires a lot of pieces, but I don't want to get up here and make by any stretch of the imagination that this is easy work. It's a heavy lift, but it's a lift worth doing. Yeah. And it's something that you can have some phenomenal outcomes, which with CHA is one of the prime examples of this actually working.
It takes community to build community.
Yes.
Yes. So I have a final question, and then we'd love to begin hearing from you. This is for all three, and you can kind of jump in as you feel led. But if we were to come back to the same conversation 5 years from now, what progress do you hope to see when it comes to equitable housing access and home ownership?
I hope we've hit our 1,500.
Yes.
Because that's our goal. Our shared priority is 1,500 new home buyers in 5 years. And that we have real change from a lending perspective, because for me, that's where my sweet spot, that we actually have products that are meeting the needs and not being watered down, which we're seeing because of the fear of retribution from the federal government or what have you, or maybe it's just an opportunity to finally say who you really are. That's real. But that we have financial institutions and lenders who are doing real work and opening real doors, because what we do know is that people who buy homes who have historically not been able to buy homes stay in those homes and take care of them.
Absolutely.
They don't want to come out of their homes. So losing them they're going to fight to stay in those homes. So that's my hope in the next 5 years.
Richard or Dr. King?
Well, I want to repeat myself. I hope in 5 years there'll be more locally organized activist groups of people who are willing to take action, cause good trouble, as Senator Booker said, in support of desegregation of our communities.
And then maybe you can retire then, but only then.
He said he's already retired.
Right.
He just did you a favor.
That's right. What do you think?
So for me, that the notion of affordability is not just a buzzword, but it's real. That affordability will stay affordability. Because oftentimes we can get you in, but can you stay there because it doesn't remain affordable because of taxes and gentrification and everything else. So we have to be more thoughtful about the process, but also we got to do something that my father talked about that I keep going back to him because I keep saying if people had just taken heed to his words that he wrote. I mean, the amazing thing is this man lived such an intense life, but God gave him an ability to be a prolific writer, and the material is just there. But he talked about a redistribution of wealth. He talked about a guaranteed annual income pegged to the median income, but not at the bottom. So the problem we have is we address these issues, but externally you got inflation. So now I've got to choose between keeping this home, purchasing medicine, food. And so while income may not be an issue here, overall income is a problem because as inflation rises, most of us, our income's not rising. The supplement income is not coming into play. And so we got to start thinking about diversifying, our revenue streams or our income as individuals, because otherwise, if you just look at, I got a job, I'm able to, because of all of this help and assistance, I'm able to get into a home that's affordable now. There's no guarantee. So my hope is that something happens in the economic arena around this nation that we can begin to make sure that as the mindset around affordability, around economic equity, that we really start looking at how do we make sure that people are taken care of as the cost rises. Everything rises, but it doesn't for us as people.
So sustaining
our income does not rise. That's the problem.
Yeah, thank you. Questions from the audience? Yes, there's a microphone right in the center here. If you could go to the microphone so folks online can hear, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tracy Brown, and I'm founder of Healthy Smart Homes. I appreciate the panel today, and especially your book today. I think in terms of the movement, it's extremely important to look around public policy. And I'm going to say this first, and then I'll ask a question. Having been the first statewide fair housing manager for the state of Washington and managed the Fair Housing Center for Greater Boston, and we did a lot of testing with Maura Healey and the Attorney General there. So I'm very familiar with affirmatively further fair housing and the policy. But given the fact that there may be an issue around affirmatively fair housing, do you believe that as long as, like Washington State has their revised Code of Washington, 4960, that is equivalent with the federal policy, however, because it is the state policy, we could still do some affirmatively furthering fair housing here because it's still within the state, as well as identify additional fair housing centers and provide the expertise in those areas. So around that, the question I have is, even though affirmatively furthering fair housing may be crippled on the federal level, I think the state level still provides us an access and opportunity to implement public policy because of those earlier fair housing policies. We had to be equivalent on the state level with the federal level. And just because the federal level changes, does that mean that we still have to change on the local level?
I don't think that pursuing an affirmatively furthering fair housing policy depends on either the federal or state governments. You can do it yourselves without the support of either government to do it, and the Trump administration will go after you. And you've got to be prepared to resist that. And we're not going to accomplish anything, especially in this period, if we're afraid to take risks, if we're afraid to do things, if we decide we're going to accommodate to everything.
That's right.
Now, it may be we'll be defeated in some of these things. But the act of trying and resisting and going ahead and doing these things is going to build support for more resistance. And let me say this, I've been talking to Natasha about this. As you know, last Saturday, there were demonstrations against the Trump administration around the country. 600,000 people participated. The theme of them was hands off our Social Security, hands off our Medicaid, and so forth. I went to the one in Oakland, California, a community that is rapidly gentrifying, but still has a substantial black population, middle-class black population. The demonstration was all white. I spoke to people I know in Washington and New York. Those demonstrations were all white. I'm trying to figure out why that was, because that is a harbinger of danger. If we are not going to be able to come together on issues as drastic as the dictatorial policies the Trump administration is following, we have no hope of making the kinds of progress and the kinds of small things that we've been talking about today. So I think this is a very troubling development. I've been in a lot of demonstrations in my time. I've never been in one that was so white. And I'm trying to figure out why that was and what we can do about it. I don't know if the organizers of the demonstration didn't reach out to black groups. That might be it. I don't know if there's some reason why African Americans in general thought that this wasn't their fight. But it's all of our fights.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
That's exactly what she just said.
Exactly. That's it.
And I could just say a little bit to that piece. I think the issue is that through the years, in most instances, we've stood alone in our struggles, in our battles. And I'll never forget in 2017 when Trump was inaugurated, Dick Gregory was still living at that time. And he was in an interview with Roland Martin. And Roland said, well, what are we gonna do now? He said, it's over. And then he said, but what about, what people in the black community need to do? He said, this is not our battle. That's what he said in 2017. So part of it is when we are fighting for issues of justice, the white community doesn't show up for the most part. They may show up sometimes for a demonstration, but they don't show up for the further fight. And so black people have said, I'm tired. I've been out here fighting since I've been in this nation. So people are retreating and they're doing things in other ways as a community to build up the black community. So that's probably why that has happened. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but I think we have to begin to understand that, there has to be mutual support when we're talking about issues that affect all of us. But we're so used to being oppressed, depressed, exploited, beat down, that we have something in our DNA as a community that in spite of what's happening, as bad as it is, we know we're gonna get through this some kind of way because we've always been that way. We're gonna find the North Star. And so that's the reason. I'm not saying it's right, but that's the real reason.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well,
We've had this conversation, so I'm
Bernice,
curious.
forgive me, I don't accept that. I understand that you may be tired. 30 and 40-year-olds aren't tired. And that doesn't explain why they are not.
They are tired.
Well,
You may not understand it, but they are tired.
Yeah.
Because a lot of stuff that's been happening with police brutality and all that in the black community, and people have been speaking to it, nobody has shown up in other communities to stand with the black community to see that through to legislative change and other change. I'm not saying it's right. I'm telling you the reality of where people are.
In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis in 2020, 20 million Americans participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And you can go through white communities all over this country, and find Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns. They didn't do anything further. Nobody organized them to do something further.
That's true.
But it's not the case that there has been no white support for racial justice in this country. It hasn't been effective. Neither has black militancy been effective. We haven't accomplished very much. I was a participant in a civil rights movement in the 1960s, I think before any of you were born. And there were many whites involved. Some of them were murdered, as you know, in that struggle.
And when they were murdered, their stories were elevated. We
Right.
don't hear about Jimmy Lee Jackson.
Oh, we
So I'm
certainly
saying
do.
there's still this imbalance in our society.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not excusing it, I'm explaining it. That until the whole of the black community sees the white community showing up, even past the demonstration as well, because they'll say you'll get out there, like Daddy even said it. He said the white community was with us as long as they saw the brutality. But then when it came to genuine equality, that's where the backing up and the resistance came into play. And that's why he said the work going forward is going to be even harder.
Yeah.
And he did acknowledge that in order to be effective, we would have to have other allies in that struggle. But the reality is there is this kind of standoffish overall policy past the brutality, and we don't have that coalition when it comes to the, like you said, the real work that people need to do.
Yep.
That's where it's not happening.
And I think also respecting the fact that there is generational trauma in the black
Yes.
community. So 30 and 40-year-olds are tired when that trauma is given to you when you're 3 and 4 and 5 years old, and we have to carry that through the school system, and carry that when I, get my first job at 13, 14, 15 years old, and carry that to the corporate space, and carry that and carry that and carry that. That
heavy.
trauma is heavy. And many of us as black Americans carry that from the time we're told what our name is, and oh, by the way, you're black. Right? And so that's a trauma that we have to carry, that folks have gotten to a space now where we've learned. For me, I don't use the word allies because they're the ones who
Right.
wear the buttons and the signs. The accomplices are the ones who are going to get in the mud with me.
Who literally put skin in the game.
That part.
So we're not going to tie a bow on this conversation.
Yeah.
This is exactly why it's a courageous community conversation. And this is why we need more of these. More of these. I hear Richard's call loud and clear. It's got to have an interracial component at some point. But I hear Dr. King and I hear Nicole saying, we just don't want to be the birds that are leading the migration every single time. So just as birds migrate and some of the leaders go to the back so the others can come forward, that's why this is an amazing opportunity for folks who do have greater access and greater, I'm going to use the word, privilege, to leverage that privilege, not to feel shame by it, but leverage it. White folks are in different rooms oftentimes, in rooms that black folks and Latino folks and Native American folks are not in. Utilize the privilege. In the church context, I now am a minister at a predominantly white Episcopalian church. I tell them, tithe your privilege. This is that time. Can we have the next question? And it doesn't have to be on this topic because we can't conclude it completely.
Well, I'm going to help us step back a little bit by first acknowledging, Dr. King, that you talk about your father's message as that message to me as well was not historical. It was the message of this moment that we continue to live in. And we shouldn't just be worshiping the message and the work that Dr. King did. We should be making it a reality and appreciate all of your words in talking about this work. Richard alluded to this in his remarks, talking about the Covenant Homeownership Program. We worked on the bill here locally, and today, as of Tuesday last week, we have more than 300 families, first-time home buyers whose many families before, generations before, could not have access to home ownership, but today have access to home ownership. And I believe that is
awesome.
living up to that true
Awesome.
vision. And that's a milestone on its own. But we're back at the state level to drive more change on the bill and expand eligibility.
I'm going to ask you to get to your question because I do want to get this third question behind you.
We'll try to do that. And now we're expanding the eligibility for the bill. We're seeing 5 hours of public hearing because right now that hate, that bigotry is licensed and allowed. And of course, we're going to get the bill to the finish line. But now to my question, we tend to pass one policy and pat ourselves in the back and say we've made progress. And that's true, right? There are families who are having access to homeownership. But we have so many more policies to pass. And that's the reminder we continue to put in front of our Black Home Initiative network and everybody coming together. But it's going to take us moving beyond just institutional folks being in a room.
Yes.
People we have here are folks who are working in organizations, and we have some outliers who are volunteers. But we've got to get to the regular community member who shows up on their own because I live in the city of Auburn, and homeownership is important to me, and I need the city of Auburn to take this work up. And we haven't gotten to that activism. And the question I have, and we might not have answers to this today, is how do we get to that true activism? And I think it's a step back from the multiracial and who else shows up. It's all of us at that community level beginning to have those conversations, whether that's in a church, that's in a group that's active. Right now, there is no real connection, even if we have this network that's doing phenomenal work. We don't have a regular resident in the city of Kent who just shows up on their own without an institution that's driving the works. So how do we get there? Are there jurisdictions who are doing that well? And what are some pro tips for us to move that work forward? Sorry for the long question.
Nicole.
Well, I would say part of that, it goes down to shaking off that fear of retribution or what you think may or may not happen. At some point, we're going to get burned, right? But if you're doing it in coalition, we're all getting burned and it won't hurt as much. But really understanding that if you have a heart for this, getting out there and doing it, you'd be amazed who might show up with you. Who's going to come because they see your courage getting out there and doing that work. And then that's how coalition builds. Right, that's how BHI, we had a lot of folks who were outliers, and patients know this until they kind of saw what we were doing and that this was real and taking root, and it took some time. But I think for just that individual person on the ground, what you're probably doing at home can then resonate and translate to outside of the home to support the broader community. So I think getting away from that individualism that is so very Americanized and having that, Jesus was about the social context of things and supporting everyone. He said protect the children and the widows. Jesus was concerned with those folks, and so we need to be concerned with those same folks and understand that it's not about me, my, or the I, but about the broader community and how we can support that. And my work matters, even if it's something small. It matters because it makes a collective bang across whatever city or municipality you find yourself in.
Thank you. We'll take one last question.
Thank you, Natasha. Dr. King, this is for you. And it relates to that logo that is right behind you some 20-some years ago when we found out that the brand of Habitat exceeded that of Nike and Starbucks. Today, when the eye of Sauron is about and the fear pervades, the question I have, and it's been alluded to by patients and Nicole now, the job site at Habitat is the least threatening port of entry we have for meaningful interaction. There is no door to darken, right? You go out in community, you volunteer, you interact. Where do you see Habitat right now as a movement in the midst of this environment, and how willing do you think the board and the leadership and the movement is to put the brand on the line? How can we be real courageous?
You're asking me.
Yes, I am. And sorry to put you on the spot, but there are people here because of that brand.
That's right. That's right. All right. All right, then. We have all these other Habitat senior leaders over here, but I guess I'm going to speak for it. I will say, and thank you for asking that question, actually. I think it is a very important question for us all to ask in this network. Again, thanking Habitat for Humanity King County, Seattle-King County, and other habitats that are joining on. Those of you who've known me, I've been in this network for now 13 and a half years. I truly believe that this is Habitat's moment. To your point, and thank you for that Lord of the Rings allusion.
Right.
Lord of the Rings allusion. Habitat is a Christian-founded organization. Nicole beautifully brought into the conversation our founding at Koinonia. And Koinonia quickly founded in South Georgia in a very divisive time, so divisive that your dad and Ambassador Young said they weren't even gonna go there, it was too hot. And I'm like, y'all went to Selma, but y'all couldn't go to Americus, Georgia? That's how hot and controversial it was. And it was in that incubator that the vision for Habitat was birthed. I believe that that birthing in that moment compels Habitat to be that door opener and to be even more courageous in this moment. So we're very focused on continuing our work, focused on housing equity, focused on creating a world where everyone has a decent place to call home. In this moment, it is something that requires us to be strategic. It requires us to evaluate mission-worthy risks. It requires us to leverage the amazing brand that we have, because we can, like I mentioned earlier, we can tithe that leverage and that privilege because we can get into rooms that other organizations can't get into just yet. So convening moments like this is part of leveraging that brand in a courageous way to have a conversation that many folks are shying away from now. Stepping into the work of advancing Black homeownership, doing the work that my team is the Housing Opportunities and Mission Engagement team. We're doubling down on our work in doing bridge building and figuring out ways to scale the ability of different communities to come together in meaningful ways to do exactly what BHI is doing. And Richard, it is interracial. It is finding ways to bridge divides across race, across gender, across income, to have these hard conversations that allow all these layers, the developers, the lenders, the banks, the community activists, the community residents, to come together and say, how do we become the best that we can be in this moment? How do we all take ownership of that? And realizing you may have this $1.2 million home and live in a bubble until. That until moment unites us all. And we as a country, I think we have yet to be our best selves. The journey from Juneteenth to July 4th is real. How do we bridge and journey together to make this country all that it would be? The brilliance of Dr. King's words and the brilliance of the civil rights movement is that it didn't create an ethos that didn't already exist. It leaned into the beliefs that framed the very foundation of this country and called it to be so. That's our opportunity today. Thank you to the King Center for the Beloved Community Talk partnership with our Courageous Community Conversation. Thank you to Seattle-King County, Habitat for Humanity. Thank you to Black Home Initiative. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Dr. King, for the work that you continue to lead, the soul-stirring work that forces that qualitative change into a quantitative one. Thank all of you, those who joined online, for being a part of this courageous community conversation, figuring out how we can build beloved community together. Because where do we go from here? We go exactly where we choose to go. We go exactly where we strategize to go. We go exactly where we together can craft and create a vision where all of us have a thriving and beloved community. Thank you all for being a part of it.
All right, to wrap up, I just want to, again, one more time for our panel, really appreciate the conversation. So as we wrap up today, we're not only looking back of the work that has been done by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other fair housing advocates, we also want to focus on looking ahead at how we build the future of fair housing. With 58 affordable housing units, our project at 5022 MLK is Habitat Seattle's largest endeavor to date, and also the largest Habitat for Humanity single-building multifamily project in the country. I know that's a mouthful. I'd also be remiss with so many supporters in the room to mention this is not our only project. It's a piece of over 300 houses we have under construction or on the tail end of permitting that are about to break ground, and we've done that because of support from everyone like you all in the room. But back to 5022 MLK, located in the Columbia City neighborhood. It capitalizes on smart density design with 5 stories of condominium homes. The project will also include a 2,000 square foot outdoor courtyard designed to encourage a sense of community within the building. As with all new projects developed by Habitat here in Seattle, the community will offer families making less than 80% of area median income affordable homes with mortgages set in a way that they can afford. The property will also be placed in a land trust, ensuring permanent affordability for future generations. In an area with median incomes north of $850,000 and rising, these homes will ensure that families will continue to have a place to build lives in Seattle for generations to come. Dr. King, if you could join me as I announce the name of the project. Make sure I have this facing the right direction. I do. So without further ado, the name of our new building, Liberty Commons. Did we get enough? Thank you.
Awesome.
All right. Yeah, you want to take it? So the name Liberty Commons honors Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of the freedom promised in our Constitution to all people. Commons are the land or resources that belong to or affect the whole of a community. Liberty Commons, both the structure and the hope it represents, belongs to this community. Habitat for Humanity Seattle-King County serves as stewards of this project and community, and we ask that all of you join us in this important undertaking. Thank you again. Thank you again to our partners at Habitat for Humanity International, the King Center, the Black Home Initiative, and our speakers. Thank you to the Northwest African American Museum for opening your doors to us today. Guests, you're all invited to enjoy the exhibits after the event concludes today if you haven't had a chance to. And finally, thank you to our audience, both here and at home. Our coalition of fair housing advocates is not possible without your support. Together, we can work towards a future where everyone has a decent place to live and a beloved community of their own. Thank you.
I wanted to see this. Thank you. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah.